just saw all of you last night, I think, at the party. I hope everyone had fun. It's always really great to have the spot right after lunch. That's when everyone's really nice and attentive and awake. It's almost as good as the opening spot. You know, the morning after the party. This is a chat on care and feeding of Magento developers. So I've already met a lot of you already. So many of you have heard some of this story, from me directly earlier at the conference. So who I am. Again, I'm Ben Marks, but I was, for a long time, my introduction into the Magento world started at a company called Blue Acorn. They're a gold solution partner in the United States. And I was the very first employee that was hired. So this was October of 2008, so I've got a little over 6 years in the Magento world. In my time there, I served as a, I guess, not really full stack, but as a pretty full picture, full plate developer. So my first day on the job was a copy of Magento 1.1.6 and a Photoshop document. Right? So I had a PSD, and I got these two things from my new boss, and I said, "Sure, I'll have the site up in 2 weeks." I was wrong. About 2 months later, the site finally launched, and I remember those days, the early days of Magento development. And we were talking about this earlier at lunch. The only two resources out there were like Alan Storm's blog and Inshu's blog. Everything else was just crap. There was just a lot of really bad information out there. People hadn't seen anything like Magento before. I remember, I'll even own up to one of the worst crimes I've ever committed in the Magento world, and even in my life, actually. Needed to have a box with links on the left side, underneath another navigation menu, and I couldn't figure out how to do it with Layout XML, so I totally moved it with JavaScript. I felt so bad about that. I was actually, at one point, I swore to myself I would go back and fix it. But then the company closed the store. I don't think it had anything to do with my code. I hope it didn't. Eventually, it was interesting what happened. I don't remember the day it happened, but one day I was hanging out in IRC, and I think I noticed that I was answering more questions than I was asking. And then I found Stack Overflow and started answering questions, and I guess that's part of the reason how I ended up being a trainer at Magento. So I started spending a lot of time on the road doing trainings for actually working for Magento, which was pretty cool. Little did I know that I would end up actually literally working for Magento like I do now. So now I'm the Magento evangelist, which basically means that I go out and get to hang out with all of you guys. It's basically the coolest job on the planet. And I spend my time listening to your concerns and trying to make sure that you guys are getting the company's message, and that your message is getting into the company. So I still do Magento training, and I still work as in an advisory role, especially for certifications. So that's some of my particulars. I've actually spent over half a year in classrooms teaching people. So Magento training has been really near and dear to my heart. I always remember what it was like starting out. I remember that the early days when you just couldn't find any information and nothing made sense, and you had to believe that smart people made this software. But that's essentially what I'm getting into with this talk is how we can an approach I discovered over time, doing the trainings for Magento and then running the development department at Blue Acorn. So, we'll start with a nice, clear picture. I like to give a visual representation of what it's like being a Magento developer. So when I started, this picture was taken literally the week before I started my job at Blue Acorn. So the week before I met Magento, right? You'll notice just nice Samson-like locks of hair. This was taken down in the Virgin Islands. I'm sure that was the only rum drink I had that day. I remember being young. I noticed I was the only one who left the party at 11 or at 10:30 yesterday. So this was me. Then, like a couple years later, at Imagine with this guy's Greg, a really cool guy. Just got married. He's the front end lead at Blue Acorn, and you'll notice slightly less hair. And then by the time I actually left Blue Acorn, or was about to leave Blue Acorn, yeah, that was me. completely done. I was actually running a 10K in Los Angeles back in December with Roy Rubin, who you may or may not know. He invented Magento. Really nice guy. So yeah, I like to use that as a presentation. It's sort of like you just lose your hair over time dealing with Magento. So this is pretty much on point, I think, with this cartoon actually hung up it may even still be on the walls at Blue Acorn. The expletive-driven development. So just WTFs per minute, right? Magento is the first experience in my life where I realized I knew how to talk like a sailor. The experience. How many of you all are relatively new Magento developers? A few of you. Okay, cool. Yeah, it's frustrating, right? It can be really frustrating, especially if you don't have a good mentor. What's actually even more frustrating, when I came into Magento, I've met a lot of people who've been in the same boat. They might know Zen Framework, right? And so they come in thinking, oh, it's a Zen Framework-based application, so I'm sure I'll do just fine. I can figure anything out. I know MVC. And then you sort of get into the code and you're like, wow, what's going on here? And later on in life you figure out, oh, well, clearly there were Java developers who were just writing a Java MVC and PHP. But there's a lot of soul searching and code searching that has to happen before you get to enlightenment. So I like to point out to people that Magento has a very steep learning curve. So this is a conversation I have with developers. It's a conversation I have with business owners, and just to say, look, you've got a lot of work to do to get your people up to speed, and you need to be prepared for that. It's okay. It's okay to let people find their way, but it's better to provide a little bit of guidance, or else they kind of end up stranded here. This was a dam actually in Italy, and there's a nice kebab shop at the bottom. I don't know that there's a kebab shop, but I want to open up one. So the question really becomes, why is it so hard? Like why would you build something that is intentionally complicated? And Magento didn't build something that was intentionally complicated. So the code isn't the problem. I think e-commerce is the problem. I have this conversation a lot when I go out to the PHP conferences, and we start talking. Inevitably, if you're wearing a Magento shirt, it's like having a target. people would just come up and they'll just be like, Magento, I hate Magento. Okay, well, all right. So what do you use for e-commerce? Well, they use Magento. I mean, it's definitely the best option that you have in the PHP world, especially if you have any kind of any kind of complexity, if you have any kind of need for out-of-the-box functionality. But ultimately what I realized, especially after going to so many PHP conferences this year, is that every developer that has to deal with commerce they've got tough challenges to solve, because we have to really closely model these business processes and regulations and everything and we have to enshrine this stuff in code. And with Magento, you've got this amazing app that can be used by someone who is selling a few things a month, all the way up to enterprise businesses. So an application that's able to do this is, I don't know, I'm actually surprised that Magento can cover that kind of breadth, right? Especially because e-commerce is hard. So the complexity, again, is not Magento's fault, I like to say. And this is the conversation that I have with these people at PHP conferences. They come up and they want to yell at me about Magento, and by the end of the conversation, almost always they have justification for, or what I see are justifications for why Magento does what it does. They come up and they say, EAV sucks, it's terrible, you should never do this. And I say, okay, how do you solve the problem of arbitrarily variable, entity attributes? Like, how do you solve that problem? And they don't have a solution for it. So it's just little moments like that help demonstrate, oh, this is tough. We'll talk about checkout processes. We'll talk about payment logic, taxes. All this stuff is really, really hard. In fact, I was just reading about some brand new regulations for VAT that are going to apply in the UK, I guess, after January 1st. It just seems like it's getting more and more complex. Another thing that is true is that teaching is hard. Teaching is definitely the hardest thing I've ever had to do. It's something I've enjoyed for a long time. I was a professional musician for several years, and I started teaching mostly because I wasn't playing enough gigs to pay rent, which is I found out when I became an adult is a thing. And it was terrifying, that first time the first drum student walks in and sits down at the practice pad kit, and I'm at the main kit, and they're like, they hand me an AC/DC song, and they're like, I want to learn, Back in Black. And of course, as a drummer, I'm like, oh, that's some great 2/4 stuff. And then you get into it, and there's some kind of interesting little things that the drummer does, and trying to teach that. And I remember just that warm feeling of hot feeling, like I don't know if I can do this. Same thing applies. I remember the very first time I taught Magento class. Getting into someone's mind and understanding, looking at how they are looking at the code, or looking at how they're looking at the music, and being able to explain to them in a way that will help them get the message. That's probably the hardest part about teaching. It's also the most rewarding. When you take something, I was telling someone about this, I think at the party last night. There's a difference between knowing something because you can see it like that, right? But you've got one perspective. But with Magento or anything else, when you start to teach, what happens is you have to get into that person's head and look at it from their angle. And so what ends up happening is you end up with this this perspective that you don't have, that you didn't have before, and you start looking at the code from all different angles. I've taught the fundamentals class over 30 times. I really enjoy teaching it. It's a week every single time, and it is something that in every single class, someone always asks me a question that I would never be able to think of because I know the code too well. But they're looking at the code fresh, and they've got this crazy idea about the architecture. And usually, I'll get a smile on my face, and I'll say, wow, no, that's not how it works at all. But man, what a really interesting perspective. And all that does is it adds more perspective. It adds more resolution to this overall picture. So that's a skill that evolves over time. I don't know that people can really, I don't know I guess there is some talent in teaching, but I think it's a skill that requires practice, and it's something that's never perfected. I don't think that you can ever perfect your practice as a teacher. So, as far as I've gotten in the teaching world, this is what I've figured out for Magento. We started at Blue Acorn with Trial by Fire. That's how I started. Again, Photoshop, Magento 1.1.6. It didn't go well for me, and in my opinion, it didn't go well for anyone that we did this with. Some developers who are really good, especially developers who know Java, already are very familiar with Java, MVC, will adapt pretty quickly to Magento. But for the most part, taking someone and throwing them into the world of Magento and then throwing them on billable hours, client requirements, what you end up doing is you end up taking time away from the other developers who have to help that developer. You potentially have some really ill-conceived solutions that may make it all the way through QA, I've seen it happen, and into production. It works, but a few weeks later or a month later, you find out that you baked in a whole bunch of technical debt that you're going to have to resolve at some point. So instead, what happened at Blue Acorn, and I'd love to say that I was sitting there, with my journal and my coffee, sitting in a cafe in Paris and just looking out at Champs-Élysées and came up with this idea. But this really only happened over time. Without maybe even meaning to, we ended up with a culture of learning, right? So this is what I advocate for. I like to remind people. This is actually how I help sell the Magento U class. You're going to pay for somebody to learn. Now, you will pay. It's just who you're paying and how much it costs you. So, is it better to throw someone into the fire and let them essentially cost the organization in terms of lost opportunity because of all the other developers who are going to have to carry the load because of the mistakes that they're going to make? Or do you want to have a focused, intentional time to educate them? So, obviously, I like the latter approach. So, a learning culture, in my estimation, is a culture where everyone is always teaching and learning. So, pairing up developers, giving them the opportunity to come up with solutions and present those solutions. That's a way to kind of start to bake in the teaching, right? So when you get people to get up in front of each other and talk about their solutions and explain what they've built to their coworkers, they don't know it, but they're being introduced into that teaching and mentoring model. One of the other aspects of a learning culture, I think, is you need to remove the impediment. You need to remove the fear of failure. I mean, you can never eliminate it completely because everyone will hold onto some of that themselves. But if you want to reduce some of those impediments, you've got to let people know that they will break things, right? And then you want to give them cycles of feedback, right? This is something that's really, really hard to get right because it's very subtle, but it's really important, and that's the assessment and reassessment cycles. So that means let them do their work, let them revisit it, let their coworkers do some reviews, and I would, if you can, not every organization can, but if you can afford it, and I would argue that it's more expensive to not do this, make sure that these people know that they're not responsible for billable hours. We did, at Blue Acorn, we would spend up to 3 months for a person, for a very junior developer who had a really, who just came in and really wowed us in the interview and had a really, obviously a really analytical mind. That's the right person. But there were people that they came in fresh out of computer science class, out of their computer science degree. And I asked them what they knew about web development, and they assumed that there was like a persistent socket opened between their browser and the server. I'm like, wow, that would be really interesting if that happened. But that's not how it works at all. And so we'd have to explain how HTTP works. I'd have to explain the stateless nature of client-server communication. Those are the people that took 3 months. So that's a lot of time to invest in somebody. You're looking at a quarter of a person's salary is actually spent in their education. The trade-off, of course, is that person usually ends up becoming exceptionally loyal. So I'm curious how this works, in cultures all over the place. I was just in China last week, and I was talking with some people there, actually. There's a French entrepreneur who has a Chinese dev shop doing Magento work. And I know in China, the sense of sort of employee loyalty in the tech industry, it really doesn't exist. And what this guy had found out, he kind of stumbled on the same thing that we did, which is that if you really show an interest and you really are investing in these people, they don't take the education and then run and get a better paying job. They stay. They buy into. They see the value of the quality of life. They see the value of an organization that cared enough about them to give them that kind of education. Also, this is certainly important to me. Don't forget to be healthy. I do this job much differently now than when I first started, right? So making sure that people are taking care of themselves outside of work. Get them to ride their bike to work, whatever. Steal their keys. Sick employees are not productive employees. So that's my general philosophy, right? That's the background for this. So a rough prescription for a training program for developers, because as I talk with shop owners and senior developers, they're like, yeah, 3 months is too much. Maybe 1 month, okay. So for a month, like a month-long plan, I say that you've got to teach people the MVC. You've got to teach them the application, right? The framework side of things. So teach them, show them the basics, show them that Magento likes to hide errors, enable developer mode, show them how caching and configuration XML issues can cause problems. I'm probably not the only person in here who has sat there and debugged non-functional code only to remember that I had forgotten to clear the cache. I don't know how many hours of Magento development have been lost to this, but I know I'm not the only one. Really explaining our psychotic use of XML is actually also really important, I think. Show them kind of how to navigate the code, right? So show them the autoloader, show them where the code pools are, show them the precedents, right? So if you open up mage.php and you can see the include paths being set, right? That's because I like to follow the request flow. This was something I was also talking about last night. We were talking about training. Take the flow of a user request as it hits index.php, goes into the front controller, goes from the front controller to the routers to the controllers into the view, and then the views invoke the models, right? It's a nice, pretty picture, right? It's not always that consistent, but giving people the ability to find their own way, that is That's probably the single most impactful thing you can do for a developer, in my opinion, in the Magento world, right? Because developers, we are a self-educating lot. We will help ourselves, right? We should be. I know I never answered a question when someone would come up and ask me an obvious question with an obvious answer that would be at the top of Google if they literally took what they asked me and put it in Google. At most, I would hand them a "let me Google that for you" link. So once you've shown them the basics, or give them, have them sit down with a senior developer if possible, and start with the contact module, right? So this really, really old module in Magento. It's very simple, just does one thing. That's the contact us form. Really simple controller. That's a good way to walk them through the request flow. And then go through some basic exercises, pair programming. So the senior developer, does anyone here have a practice that does pair programming? Anyone? A few of you? Yeah, it's really expensive. It's a really expensive thing to do from an opportunity perspective and a salary perspective, because you got two people working on something. But this is an investment that you're making that will help speed up the junior. So the senior navigates, and that means that the senior is sitting there, hands in their pockets, whatever, not touching a keyboard, and they're walking through building a module, for example. And they're having the junior developer open the files and type the code, create the XML, etc. It's a really quick way for them to get actually nice and tactile with the code. It's a really quick way to get them to learn. So that's day one. And then after that, I point them to the developer series on the Magento knowledge base. That is Alan Storm's content, right? So he's got that content on his blog, and Magento booked him to write that content, and we still have it on our knowledge base. And then have them spend that first week doing that. There's, I think, 11 different sections to it, and it's cool. You just build a weblog, right? You just build a weblog module, so you're creating a blog entry entity, creating setup scripts, working with layout XML, etc. And then each day, they need to do an LE5, right? Who knows what an LE5 is? Explain like I'm 5. But they need to do that to the senior. So they have to, this is another way of sneaking in that mentoring, that teaching moment, right? So they have to tell that senior developer, oh, well, I made this. I don't know about you guys, but when I started with Magento, not when I started, but even like a year into my Magento development, if I wanted to create models, I knew what to put in configuration XML. I knew where to put my files, but I didn't know why. I just knew that if I did this stuff, it worked. And that's not how grown-ups develop. I did that I had the blinders on for far too long, right? It's inexcusable, really. And so you want to go ahead and get people into the mindset that they should be freely exchanging information and they should be seeking confirmation of their understanding with their coworkers. Then also have them. One of the first developers I hired at Blue Acorn had this great idea, and once he took over for the development shop, he actually does this in reverse order. He has them read the user guide front to back. It's 700 short pages, and they have to know the user guide before they touch code. I don't really care the order that you do it in, but you can't be a good Magento developer if you don't understand the application. You'll end up building things that already exist. I've definitely done that. And that's especially important in our business because don't forget that you have users. You have users out there who may even be used to using the system, but then when it comes time to solve a requirement of theirs, you might be able to compose that solution or synthesize that solution by marrying two existing features or extending one of the existing features. And you should do that whenever possible, because in their mental map, they know, for example, if they need to do customer segmentation. If what they want is some kind of customer segmentation, if they've got enterprise, they're using They've got customer segmentation built in. They may need a segment logic that doesn't exist. But as a developer, you have to be aware of customer segmentation. You have to be aware of how users interact with it in order to build an effective solution. That kind of knowledge awareness begins by understanding the interface, and you can start with the user guide. So as you get into the rest of the second week, take what they've been doing so far and build on it, right? So show them how the application is extensible. Show them how class rewrites work, and then explain to them that they should avoid class rewrites if they can. Show them how observers work, and show them that that's really the one true way to do customization, if possible. And then teach them layout XML. That was the thing. Layout. Who doesn't like layout XML? Go ahead, put your hand up. Okay, everyone raising their hand probably could benefit from some of that missing documentation, right? I hated layout XML. Oh, I hated it until I understood it. Most of the really, really experienced Magento developers that I've met, they may even philosophically be opposed to layout XML, but it's actually really quite brilliant. What it does, if you think about it, the classic MVC sense, classic MVC, like I need recently viewed products collection, okay, on a page, on a view. So in my controller action, I would invoke a recently viewed product collection, and then I would hand that off to a very unintelligent, unpowerful view layer, right? Well, Magento doesn't do that. Magento gives its view layer, uses this view model concept, and gives its view layer a lot of power, which you can see from $this in any template. But we have a really amazing system that allows us to separate front-end developer work and back-end developer work. So what happens is if you need that recently viewed product collection on a different route, well, guess what? You've got, in the classic MVC sense, well, you have to have a back-end developer instantiate the collection in a new controller action, etc. In Magento, you just take a spot of XML and put it into a new location, right? And duplicate it into a new location, because the view handles that. Like that's one of the in my mind that's probably the architectural intent of layout XML, is that it can separate the work of back-end developers and front-end developers. I might be wrong about that, but that certainly seems right. Start there, and then take a look at layout XML and see if that changes your perspective. Also, get them into EAV application, the EAV space. Show them how front-end models and back-end models and source models work. Explain to them the sort of schema and a schema concept of EAV, and make sure they understand the purpose. I mean, the fact that an admin user can go in and create new attributes, add those attributes to new attribute sets, and you have these sort of amazing variations in your product types. That's all possible because of EAV. And make sure you're always doing code reviews by a senior developer if possible. And then for the next couple of weeks, give them either current e-commerce exercises or give them exercises that you have from the history. So this is still not billable work, but these are things that will prepare them for the work that they're going to be doing. And then the whole time, you've got to make sure you're reassessing. So, in closing, see, that was easy, right? It's really easy to build a Magento practice. Everyone will do it now. Building learning culture involves the whole organization. It really does. Everyone has to be committed to it. You can't have people making fun of others for not understanding something. They've got to be encouraged to share, and they've got to be encouraged to say, hey, I don't understand how this works. So one of the things I've observed is that learning is a learned behavior, right? Active learning. Leading by example, making sure people are comfortable with not being right all the time. For continued growth, the Magento certification, developer certification, it's a worthwhile pursuit. It's not necessarily an easy test to pass. I'm fond of telling people that I wrote the entire basics section and somehow managed to miss one of my own questions on the exam. The study kit that my colleague Vinay Kopp made it's the certification moderator study kit, I think. It's $50. It is one of the best investments you can make for your company. It presents exercises in each of the different areas of the certification focuses on, and it's great because you may not, in your day-to-day work, you may have no experience extending Magento's API, but in that study kit, you have to extend the API, so you learn how the WSDLs work, etc. It basically gives you little job requirements and then makes you satisfy those, and it comes with some of the solution code. I also, if you can, I was very lucky that Kevin, the owner of Blue Acorn, actually, paid me. He said, I want you to become like a star on Stack Overflow for Magento. And I did. And so he was paying me to Stack Overflow. Maybe I'm the original Marius. I don't know. I still don't know how Marius makes money. But this is a really good way to get exposure to additional work requirements, right? Hanging out on Stack Overflow, and now we have the Magento Stack Exchange website, right? And back then it was just Stack Overflow and the Magento tag, and that Magento in brackets right there, that's actually a link. So this will be up on the conference website later, so you can click right through. You can also go to Stack Overflow and just enter Magento, and it'll take you to all the delicious Magento questions. Helping people out is another way of getting in front of people and seeing based on the way they ask questions, you can get a sense of how they're looking at the code. It's another way to get perspective. Then you continue the pairing as much as possible. Another fun thing, if you can do it in your organization, is Mage Kata. So it's just a code kata where you come up with an interesting task and then get people to solve it with ever declining code size and ever more elegant solution, right? And you kind of reiterate, go through different permutations of solution. And of course, continue the reassessment cycle. So the tools and resources that you should be looking at, PHP Storm, I'm definitely not a shill for them, but it's a fantastic product. I don't get into the debate about the best IDE. Usually this is when someone says yay Vim or yay Emacs. So PHP Storm has a great plugin called Magento that does a lot of it reduces. I actually don't use Magento, but only because I like to type everything by hand so I can remember it. But Magento is great because it takes a lot of the opportunity for typos away from you. There's Magento U. That's our education arm. So there are online classes, there are in-person classes, there's on-demand classes. The catalog is ever expanding. Xdebug, of course, a good step debugger is imperative. If you have developers who are not using step debugging, don't fire them, but shame them. That's the one time it's okay to shame someone. Get them using a step debugger. Die debugging is really, really slow in the Magento world. So there's also a whole host of other tools. N98 Matron. This is a fantastic command line tool that can help just do a lot of the things that you need to do as a Magento developer. Commerce Bug is one of the many plugins that you can use for Magento. That's by my buddy Alan Storm, whose website is up there. There's tons of good content out there. My colleague Vinay's got this great book out there called Grokking Magento. I edited that book and I learned stuff. These days we actually have a lot of good information. Also, I'd be remiss to not say Zend server now has something called Z-Ray or Z-Ray, and there's actually a Magento plugin for it, and it's actually really handy. When it's enabled, like in your inspector, you end up with a list of all the layout handles that have been loaded on the page, all of the events that are firing, etc. But the main tool, of course, is the community, right? In general, we've got each other. So this is what I was talking about in the opening yesterday. Sharing your information, getting it out there, helping each other. This is the biggest resource that we have. So, any questions? No questions. It's that complete a solution? All right. Well, thank you all very much. This has been a great conference.